People arrived here, never worked the fields, and then disappeared. The plantation took shape in the closing decades of the 18th century, at a moment when coastal wealth flowed inland along tidal rivers and creeks. Its founders were not planters by origin, but merchants, a family whose fortune had been made at sea and along wharves thick with rope, tar, and imported goods. Their ships carried rice, timber, and indigo outward and returned with manufactured wares and credit. Like many families of their position, they sought to convert commercial success into landed permanence. Records suggest the initial purchase was modest by later standards, a tract of low-lying land judged promising for rice, bordered by marsh and fed by a navigable waterway that allowed access to coastal trade routes. In its earliest years, the estate was more an experiment than a showpiece. The first structures were functional rather than grand, built to house overseers, store tools, and shelter the enslaved laborers brought in to clear and drain the land. Rice cultivation demanded patience and capital. Dikes had to be raised by hand, floodgates fitted, and fields leveled with an understanding of tides that blended African knowledge with European engineering principles. The family's mercantile background proved useful, as they were accustomed to long investments and delayed returns. Account books from the period indicate steady infusions of money, suggesting that profits from trade underwrote years when the fields yielded little. Over time, the plantation expanded, absorbing adjacent parcels as opportunities arose. By the turn of the 19th century, it had become a substantial rice-producing operation, its fields stretching in measured grids across the wetlands. The labor force grew accordingly. Bills of sale and shipping manifests indicate enslaved men, women, and children arriving from other colonies and inland markets, many selected for skills believed useful in rice cultivation. The estate's output increased, and with it the family's standing among the planter elite. Though they maintained urban residences and commercial interests, the plantation became a central pillar of their wealth, binding them more tightly to the land and the system that sustained it. As decades passed, ownership followed the expected path of inheritance. The founding generation aged and died, and control passed to children and then grandchildren who had not known the uncertainties of the early years. By the middle of the 19th century, the plantation was managed by a later generation heir whose temperament contrasted sharply with that of his forebears. Contemporary correspondence describes him as withdrawn, a man who preferred solitude to social display. Unlike neighboring planters who attended assemblies, served in local offices, or cultivated reputations as hosts, he appeared rarely in public. When he did, observers noted a reserve that bordered on discomfort. Management under this heir became more distant and impersonal. He retained overseers to handle daily operations and communicated through written instructions rather than frequent visits. Plantation journals suggest that he spent extended periods away, sometimes at an urban residence, sometimes traveling without clear purpose. His absence did not signal neglect in the financial sense. Accounts were kept, repairs authorized, and crops marketed efficiently. Yet the social life of the estate changed. Where earlier generations had entertained neighbors and kin, mid-century records show fewer gatherings and a narrowing of contact with the surrounding planter community. It is in the records from this period that an unusual pattern emerges regarding the enslaved population. Comparative studies of neighboring estates suggest a more uniform demographic profile elsewhere, often skewed heavily toward adult field hands. On this plantation, however, inventories reveal a broader range of ages and a gender balance that was less common in large rice operations. There were more children than expected, and a notable number of elderly individuals who might elsewhere have been sold or relocated. Some accounts suggest this reflected the owner's reluctance to engage actively in the buying and selling of people, preferring stability over the disruptions of the market. Others caution that such interpretations should be made carefully, noting that economic calculations could also favor maintaining a self-reproducing labor force. The owner's reclusive nature extended to his relationships with those he enslaved. Unlike planters who cultivated a visible, if authoritarian, presence in the fields, he remained largely unseen. Discipline and daily oversight fell to subordinates, creating layers of authority that could both soften and harden conditions, depending on the individuals involved. Enslaved people on the estate would have known the owner more as a distant name than a familiar figure. His power, abstract but absolute, exercised through documents and decisions made elsewhere. Despite these peculiarities, the plantation remained integrated into the regional economy. Rice shipments continued downriver, and profits were reinvested in maintenance rather than expansion. There is little evidence of innovation or ambition beyond preserving what had been built. This conservatism may have mirrored the owner's personality, or it may have reflected broader uncertainties as soil exhaustion, competition, and shifting markets challenged the rice economy. In this sense, the estate became a place suspended in time, outwardly stable but inwardly constrained by forces beyond any single person's control. The contrast between the plantation's origins and its mid-century character is striking. As the decades advanced and the plantation entered a more settled phase of its existence, surviving records began to present a picture that was increasingly difficult to reconcile with outward appearances. Census returns and parish registers, which elsewhere often reinforced one another, offered here a series of quiet contradictions. Lists of the enslaved population showed a striking imbalance in age. A high proportion were recorded as middle-aged or elderly, their names appearing repeatedly across years with little change, while children were notably scarce. On neighboring estates, baptismal records and census tallies usually reflected a steady if uneven pattern of births. On this plantation, however, such entries appeared sporadically or not at all. Church records in particular raised questions. Ministers dutifully recorded funerals and occasional baptisms, yet gaps persisted that could not easily be explained by chance alone. Some deaths noted in plantation inventories failed to appear in parish books, while other names vanished from lists without corresponding burial entries. At the same time, a few individuals appeared in church documents who were absent from plantation rolls. Historians examining these materials have cautioned against assuming deliberate falsification, noting the irregularities common to record-keeping in rural areas. Still, the cumulative effect was one of uncertainty, as though parts of the population existed only partially within the written world that sought to define them. The scarcity of children was perhaps the most puzzling feature. On a large rice plantation, even one with harsh conditions, some number of births would ordinarily be expected over time. Here, the numbers remained stubbornly low. Some accounts suggest that children were born but not consistently recorded, perhaps due to absentee ownership or lax oversight. Others propose that families may have been separated through sale or transfer before children reached an age deemed worth noting by administrators. Yet the financial records show relatively few transactions involving enslaved people during this period, reinforcing the impression of a population that neither grew nor moved in expected ways. Economic documents added another layer of complexity. On paper, the plantation possessed the land, infrastructure, and labor force necessary for substantial rice production. The fields had been cleared and diked generations earlier, and maintenance expenditures indicate that floodgates and embankments were kept in working order. Yet crop output figures told a quieter story. Shipment volumes recorded at ports and in merchants' ledgers fell short of what comparable estates produced. Year after year, yields appeared modest, sometimes unaccountably so, even in seasons when weather reports suggested favorable conditions. This discrepancy prompted speculation among later observers. Some argued that soil exhaustion or subtle environmental changes had reduced productivity more than records explicitly acknowledged. Others pointed to the age profile of the labor force, noting that a population weighted toward older individuals might struggle to meet the physical demands of rice cultivation. Without an influx of younger workers, either through birth or purchase, the estate's capacity may have declined gradually, masked by the inertia of established routines. Still, the decline was not precipitous. The plantation continued to function, generating enough income to sustain itself, though rarely exceeding expectations. Financial ledgers from the mid-century period further complicated the picture. Alongside predictable expenses for tools, repairs, and provisions appeared entries that resisted easy classification. Payments were made to intermediaries and suppliers whose services were not clearly tied to agriculture. There were charges for transport and storage that exceeded what crop shipments alone would require, and occasional outlays for goods that never appeared in inventory lists. These anomalies were not frequent enough to suggest a wholesale diversion of resources, but they were persistent enough to invite scrutiny. Some historians have suggested that the plantation may have served functions beyond simple production. Its location along navigable waterways made it a convenient site for storage or transshipment, and it is possible that goods belonging to others passed through its warehouses. Such arrangements, informal and poorly documented, could explain certain expenditures and discrepancies between output and apparent activity. Alternatively, the owner's commercial background may have led him to engage in speculative ventures, using plantation funds to support investments elsewhere. In the absence of explicit documentation, these interpretations remain tentative. Administrative practices on the estate also appear to have been unusually opaque. Overseers' reports, where they survive, are terse and focused narrowly on tasks completed rather than conditions observed. There is little commentary on the health, morale, or family life of the enslaved population. This silence may reflect the owner's preference for minimal engagement, valuing order and continuity over detailed knowledge. It may also indicate a deliberate narrowing of what was deemed worthy of record, reducing human lives to figures sufficient for accounting but insufficient for understanding. For the enslaved people themselves, these patterns would have shaped daily existence in subtle but profound ways. An aging population meant fewer young adults to share the heaviest labor and fewer children to sustain communal life. The absence of births, whether real or merely unrecorded, would have altered rhythms of hope and continuity that persisted even under bondage. At the same time, the relative stability of the population may have allowed bonds of familiarity to deepen, as individuals lived and worked alongside the same companions year after year. The plantation thus stood apart from its neighbors not through dramatic difference, but through a series of quiet irregularities that accumulated over time. Its records, fragmentary and inconsistent, offer no single explanation, only overlapping hints. They reflect an estate managed at a distance, sustained by inherited structures and habits rather than active ambition. In this environment, administrative order coexisted with demographic stagnation, and economic activity proceeded without fully revealing its purpose. Taken together, the unusual demographic profile and administrative patterns suggest a plantation caught between eras, maintaining the outward form of a prosperous rice estate while inwardly diverging from established norms. Whether this divergence arose from personal temperament, environmental constraint, or hidden commercial practices remains uncertain. What can be said is that the surviving documents, meant to impose clarity, instead preserve ambiguity, leaving later generations to read between lines written for reasons other than full disclosure. The physical arrangement of the plantation added another layer of quiet peculiarity to its history, one that observers noted even in its own time. While many rice estates followed broadly similar patterns shaped by labor efficiency and oversight, this property diverged in ways that were difficult to ignore. Rather than concentrating enslaved quarters into a single settlement within sight or easy reach of the fields, the buildings were divided into several distinct clusters. Each group stood apart from the others, separated by stretches of marsh, tree line, or unused ground, creating pockets of habitation that rarely intersected in daily movement. One cluster lay closer to the cultivated fields, positioned much as would be expected, allowing laborers to reach their work at dawn and return at dusk under the watch of overseers. Another stood nearer to storage sheds and processing areas, suggesting a population assigned to tasks beyond field labor. The most unusual grouping, however, was placed at the edge of swampland, far removed from both the main house and the primary agricultural zones. Reaching it required a long walk along raised paths that flooded easily and were often slick with mud. Contemporary descriptions suggest that this cluster was smaller and more self-contained, its isolation enforced as much by geography as by design. The reasons for this dispersed layout were never clearly articulated in surviving documents. Some later commentators speculated that it reflected an attempt to separate work functions or manage health concerns, as swamps were associated with disease and pests. Others suggested that the division served administrative or disciplinary purposes, limiting communication between groups and reinforcing a sense of separation. Whatever the intention, the result was a plantation that felt fragmented, its enslaved population divided not only by labor roles, but by physical distance that shaped daily interactions. This fragmentation extended beyond the quarters. Paths connecting the clusters were narrow and indirect, discouraging casual movement. Night travel between them would have been difficult, particularly in seasons when water levels rose and landmarks disappeared. For the enslaved people who lived there, such conditions would have reinforced dependence on assigned spaces, shrinking the world available to them and complicating the maintenance of broader communal ties. Familiarity was built within clusters rather than across the plantation as a whole, fostering localized bonds at the expense of collective cohesion. The main residence, by contrast, stood on slightly higher ground, its elevation offering both a practical refuge from flooding and a symbolic distance from the laboring population. From the outside, it appeared conventional enough, a large house suited to a prosperous estate. Yet accounts from visitors and later inventories hint at features within that departed from expectation. Several rooms were described as locked or otherwise concealed, accessible only to the owner or trusted agents. These spaces did not correspond neatly to storage, guest accommodation, or offices, and their contents were rarely itemized in estate papers. Some descriptions suggest that certain rooms were constructed or modified in ways that minimized sound and visibility, with thick walls or shuttered windows that admitted little light. While such features were not unheard of in large houses, their number and placement seemed excessive to those accustomed to more open domestic designs. Servants assigned to the main house reportedly had limited access to these areas, and their functions were not discussed openly. In a household already marked by the owner's reclusive habits, these restricted spaces contributed to an atmosphere of guarded privacy. Beyond the main residence, another structure stood apart from the rhythms of plantation life. Maintained carefully and repaired when other buildings were allowed to age, it occupied a liminal position between cultivated land and uncultivated marsh. It was neither clearly industrial nor obviously domestic. Records refer to it obliquely, noting expenditures for upkeep without specifying purpose. Unlike barns or mills, it did not appear in production tallies, nor did it house enslaved laborers on a permanent basis, at least according to surviving lists. Those who passed the property by water sometimes remarked on this building, noting its isolation and the absence of regular traffic to and from it. Its separation from daily activity gave it an air of deliberate removal, as though whatever occurred there was meant to remain distinct from the visible workings of the estate. Some later interpretations have proposed that it served as storage for valuable goods, benefiting from distance and discretion. Others have suggested more mundane uses, such as housing equipment or serving as a seasonal retreat. As with so much else, certainty remains elusive. Taken together, the layout of the plantation conveyed a sense of controlled distance. People, functions, and spaces were kept apart, linked by necessity rather than proximity. This was not the bustling, tightly organized landscape often depicted in accounts of successful rice estates. Instead, it was a place of silences and intervals, where movement was channeled and visibility limited. The physical environment mirrored the administrative style evident in the records, segmented, restrained, and resistant to easy interpretation. For the enslaved population, this environment shaped experience as powerfully as labor demands. Isolation within clusters could mean reduced oversight at times, but it also meant vulnerability, as help and witness were far away. The swamp-adjacent quarters, in particular, would have been exposed to harsher conditions, with insects, dampness, and the constant presence of stagnant water. Distance from the main house did not equate to freedom from control. Rather, it manifested control through absence, allowing authority to be felt without constant display. The owner's minimal presence reinforced this spatial logic. Rarely seen moving between clusters or inspecting buildings, he relied on the architecture itself to enforce order. Locked rooms, concealed spaces, and isolated structures all served to limit knowledge, concentrating it in a few hands. What was known was compartmentalized, and what was not known remained so by design. In such a setting, rumor and speculation flourished, filling gaps left by silence. The plantation's physical form thus cannot be separated from its social reality. Deviations from typical design were not merely aesthetic choices, but expressions of a broader pattern of withdrawal and control. They reflected an estate managed less through overt supervision than through the careful arrangement of space, an environment where separation was normalized and interaction constrained. For later observers walking its paths or studying its maps, the sense of something withheld would have been difficult to shake. In the end, the landscape itself became a document, recording intentions that written records only hinted at. Fields, quarters, locked rooms, and solitary buildings spoke in the language of placement and distance. They testified to a plantation that functioned, but did not fully reveal itself, maintaining productivity while preserving layers of privacy. Long after the people who designed and inhabited it were gone, these physical traces continued to suggest a deliberate isolation, a quiet insistence that not everything within its boundaries was meant to be seen or understood. Among the fragmentary documents that survive from the plantation's later years, a small number of personal testimonies stand apart for their specificity and quiet insistence. One of the most cited is a letter attributed to a woman who had been enslaved on the estate and who wrote after her escape. Composed some years after her departure, the letter was addressed to an abolitionist contact and intended, it seems, both as an account of her own life and as a record of conditions left behind. Its tone is measured rather than inflammatory, suggesting a desire to be believed rather than to persuade through excess. What gives the letter particular weight is the precision with which it describes the plantation's physical and social routines. The writer named paths, buildings, and landmarks with an ease that suggests long familiarity. She noted how seasons altered daily labor, how water levels changed access between quarters, and how shifts in management affected patterns of movement. These details align closely with what is known from maps and estate papers, lending credibility to her broader claims. She also described changes over time, emphasizing that the plantation she left was not the same as the one she had first known, but a place that had grown more restrictive and more divided. Among her most striking assertions was the arrival at irregular intervals of individuals who did not take part in agricultural labor. According to her account, these people were neither overseers nor field hands. They appeared suddenly, were housed away from the main quarters, and were not seen working in the fields, mills, or storage areas. Their presence was temporary, lasting weeks or months, after which they departed as quietly as they had come. She did not speculate openly on their purpose, noting only that their arrival altered routines and heightened restrictions across the estate. The letter also emphasized strict prohibitions surrounding certain areas. She wrote that some quarters were off-limits even to those who lived nearby, with punishments threatened for approaching them without explicit permission. These prohibitions were enforced unevenly, sometimes relaxed and sometimes tightened without explanation. For the enslaved population, such unpredictability bred caution. Knowledge of where one could and could not go was learned through observation and rumor rather than clear instruction, reinforcing a sense that rules existed beyond understanding. Perhaps the most unsettling passages concerned nighttime activity within the main residence. The writer claimed that gatherings took place after dark in concealed areas of the house, spaces rarely visible during the day. She described unusual movements, lights appearing in shuttered rooms, and sounds that suggested the presence of multiple people. Enslaved domestic workers, she wrote, were carefully selected and rotated, with some abruptly reassigned or removed after working near these areas. She avoided describing the nature of the gatherings, stating only that they were secretive and accompanied by heightened tension among those who became aware of them. Historians have approached these claims with caution, mindful of the pressures faced by formerly enslaved people recounting traumatic experiences. Memory, distance, and the desire to convey the seriousness of past suffering can shape testimony in complex ways. Yet many of the letter's elements correspond with independent evidence: the isolated building clusters, the locked rooms, and the administrative irregularities already noted in official records. Where it ventures beyond documentation, it does so carefully, framing observations rather than conclusions. Additional perspective comes from the account of a man who had served as an overseer on the plantation during the mid-1850s. His testimony survives in the form of an affidavit given years later during a dispute unrelated to the estate itself. In recounting his employment history, he described the plantation as markedly different from others where he had worked. Hired for his experience in rice cultivation, he expected a familiar hierarchy and scope of responsibility. Instead, he encountered boundaries that limited even supervisory authority. According to his statement, certain areas of the plantation were explicitly restricted, and he was instructed not to enter them or inquire about their use. These instructions came not from fellow overseers, but through written directives attributed to the owner himself. While overseers often operated under constraints, such blanket prohibitions were unusual, particularly when they interfered with the coordination of labor and resources. The overseer noted that he was required to submit detailed reports on fieldwork while remaining ignorant of activities occurring elsewhere on the property. He also recalled receiving requests for supplies that did not align with ordinary plantation needs. Items were ordered in quantities or combinations that puzzled him, and some were delivered to locations outside the normal chain of distribution. When he asked for clarification, he was told only that the requests had been authorized and that his role did not include questioning them. These exchanges, he stated, created unease as they placed him in a position of responsibility without corresponding knowledge. The overseer's account ends abruptly. He described raising concerns more formally, pointing out inefficiencies and inconsistencies that he believed affected productivity. Shortly thereafter, he was dismissed without warning. No cause was given, and his departure was arranged quickly, with instructions to leave the property within days. He interpreted this as a direct response to his questions, though he acknowledged that such conclusions could not be proven. His dismissal did not appear in plantation records beyond a brief notation of his replacement. Taken together, these testimonies do not form a complete narrative, nor do they offer definitive explanations. They do, however, echo one another in ways that are difficult to dismiss entirely. Both accounts emphasize restricted knowledge, unusual movements of people and goods, and a culture of enforced silence. Neither claims full understanding of what lay behind these patterns. Instead, they describe an environment in which not knowing was itself a condition of life, imposed differently on the enslaved and on hired staff. It is important to recognize the limits of such sources. Personal testimonies are shaped by individual perspective and circumstance, and the absence of corroborating documentation leaves room for doubt. Yet in this case, the testimonies do not stand alone. They intersect with architectural anomalies, demographic irregularities, and financial inconsistencies already present in the historical record. Each source, taken separately, might be explained away. Together, they suggest a pattern of deliberate compartmentalization. For the formerly enslaved woman, writing after escape, the act of recording these memories was likely an assertion of agency, a means of reclaiming narrative control over a life long constrained by others. For the overseer, his affidavit served a more pragmatic purpose, yet it revealed discomfort with a system that limited his authority while demanding compliance. Their voices differ in power and perspective, but they converge in describing a plantation governed as much by secrecy as by labor. Ultimately, these contemporary accounts deepen the sense that the estate operated on multiple levels, some visible and some intentionally obscured. They do not resolve the questions raised by the plantation layout, records, or management. Instead, they reinforce the impression of a place where information was carefully rationed and where silence functioned as a tool of control. In preserving fragments of lived experience, these testimonies remind later readers that beneath administrative abstractions lay human lives navigating uncertainty, constrained not only by bondage or employment, but by the deliberate withholding of understanding. As attention turned toward the plantation's more enigmatic functions, claims emerged that centered on medical activity conducted under the authority of the owner. Some elements of this picture are supported by surviving documentation, while others rest almost entirely on testimony and remain the subject of long-standing dispute. Together, they form one of the most difficult aspects of the estate's history to interpret, requiring careful separation of what can be demonstrated from what was alleged. What is known with relative certainty is that the owner possessed a formal education in medical subjects unusual for a planter of his generation. Records from earlier in his life indicate sustained study of anatomy and contemporary theories of mental illness, fields that in the early 19th century were only beginning to coalesce into recognizable disciplines. His library inventories list medical texts alongside agricultural manuals, and correspondence suggests an ongoing interest in emerging ideas about the mind, particularly conditions described at the time as melancholia, mania, or moral disorder. Such interests were not entirely unheard of among educated elites, but in this context they appear to have been pursued with unusual seriousness. This intellectual background intersected with legal and administrative action. Court documents show that the owner sought and received approval to establish a private facility on his property, intended to treat mental ailments among enslaved people. The language used in these filings reflects prevailing paternalistic attitudes, framing the effort as both benevolent and economically prudent. Enslaved individuals deemed unable to work due to mental distress were described as burdens that might, with proper treatment, be returned to productivity. The approval itself was not unprecedented, as private confinement for the mentally ill was common in an era when public institutions were scarce. Nonetheless, situating such a facility within a plantation setting was unusual. Supporting this purpose, financial records document the purchase of medical equipment and specialized texts. Items consistent with diagnostic and restraint practices of the time appear in ledgers, including apparatus intended for confinement and tools associated with physical examination. Payments to booksellers for medical treatises suggest continued study rather than a one-time curiosity. These expenditures align with the existence of a maintained structure set apart from daily plantation life, lending weight to interpretations that it served a medical function, at least in part. Beyond these documented elements lie the allegations that have proven far more contentious. Testimonies from formerly enslaved individuals and a small number of witnesses describe practices that went beyond treatment as it was publicly justified. According to these accounts, experimental procedures were conducted without consent, imposed on people whose status denied them the ability to refuse. The term experiment appears in later retellings rather than in contemporary records. The witnesses described interventions that were unfamiliar, repetitive, and painful, administered without clear therapeutic outcome. Isolation features prominently in these narratives. Individuals selected for treatment were said to be housed in remote quarters or confined within restricted rooms, cut off from family and community. Restraint, both physical and psychological, was described as routine rather than exceptional. Some accounts emphasize prolonged solitude, sensory deprivation, or enforced routines designed to break resistance rather than to heal. The language used by survivors conveys not only physical suffering but a deep sense of disorientation, as familiar markers of time, place, and relationship were removed. Psychological pressure is another recurring theme. Witnesses recalled threats, manipulation, and the exploitation of fear as tools to compel compliance. In an era when medical understanding of mental illness was limited and often brutal, such practices were not unique to this plantation. Asylums elsewhere employed restraint, confinement, and coercion as standard methods. What distinguishes these allegations is their setting within a plantation, where power over the body and mind was already absolute, and where oversight was minimal. Perhaps the most troubling claims concern the disappearance of individuals housed in remote quarters. Several testimonies refer to people who were taken for treatment and never returned. Names appeared briefly in inventories and then vanished, without corresponding death records or sale documents. In a system notorious for poor record-keeping regarding enslaved lives, such absences are difficult to interpret. Some historians argue that deaths may have gone unrecorded, or that individuals were quietly transferred elsewhere. Others note that the pattern of disappearance, clustered around the alleged medical facility, raises questions that cannot be easily dismissed. At the time, these allegations were not universally accepted. Contemporary defenders of the owner challenged the credibility of survivor testimony, arguing that resentment, trauma, or misunderstanding shaped recollections. They point to the absence of formal charges and the legality of the facility as evidence that nothing improper occurred. Medical practices that later generations would condemn were, they argued, consistent with the standards of the day. In an environment where enslaved people were routinely denied credibility in courts and public discourse, such defenses carried considerable weight. It is also clear that no comprehensive investigation ever took place. The plantation's isolation, the owner's social withdrawal, and the compartmentalized administration limited external scrutiny. Visitors saw only what they were permitted to see, and employees who questioned irregularities did not remain long. As a result, the historical record is uneven, rich in implication, but poor in definitive proof. What survives are fragments that resist synthesis into a single authoritative account. Modern scholars approach these materials with caution, aware of the dangers of both dismissal and overstatement. To ignore survivor testimony entirely would be to replicate the silencing inherent in slavery itself. To accept every allegation uncritically would risk projecting coherence onto experiences that were by nature chaotic and traumatic. The challenge lies in acknowledging harm and plausibility without asserting certainty where evidence does not allow it. What can be said is that the plantation provided conditions uniquely suited to unchecked authority. The owner's medical education, legal sanction, and physical control over space combined to create an environment where experimentation, broadly defined, could occur without accountability. Whether motivated by genuine belief in treatment, by intellectual curiosity or by darker impulses is impossible to determine with confidence. Motives, like methods, remain obscured by time and silence. For the enslaved individuals subjected to these practices, distinctions between treatment and punishment would have held little meaning. Removal from community, loss of autonomy, and exposure to pain or fear constituted lived realities regardless of intent. Even if some interventions were conceived as therapeutic, they unfolded within a system that denied humanity and consent. In this sense, the plantation's alleged medical activities cannot be separated from the broader violence of slavery, which framed every interaction. The disputed claims continue to shape interpretation of the estate, not because they offer clear answers, but because they illuminate the limits of the historical record. They reveal how easily power could be exercised beyond observation, and how suffering could be rendered invisible by administrative gaps and legal norms. The coexistence of documented learning and alleged abuse underscores a central tension of the period: the pursuit of knowledge entangled with systems of domination. In the end, the story of these alleged medical activities remains unresolved. What survives is a convergence of education, authority, architecture, and testimony that points toward practices both plausible for the era and deeply troubling in their implications. The absence of conclusive evidence does not erase the weight of the accounts, nor does the presence of documentation fully explain them. Between what was recorded and what was remembered lies a space shaped by secrecy, fear, and unequal power, a space that history can approach but never fully illuminate. The veil of relative obscurity that had long surrounded the plantation began to lift only late in its history, when interest from outside the region finally converged with lingering unease among those who had known the estate indirectly. Central to this shift was the work of a regional newspaper editor whose attention was drawn not by a single dramatic allegation, but by the accumulation of irregularities that refused to settle into silence. Operating in an era when investigative journalism was still emerging as a force, he approached the matter with a mixture of skepticism and determination, aware of both the risks of defamation and the moral weight of inaction. His initial efforts focused on documents rather than rumor. Court filings, shipping manifests, and parish records were examined for inconsistencies, many of which echoed patterns already noted by later historians. He compared census figures with estate inventories, traced gaps in financial ledgers, and searched for correspondence that might clarify the plantation's secondary functions. Where documents failed to answer questions, he turned to people. Formerly enslaved individuals, now scattered across towns and rural settlements, were interviewed alongside former employees and neighbors. Their accounts varied in detail and emphasis, but certain themes recurred often enough to sustain his interest. Gaining access to the plantation itself proved more difficult. Ownership had changed hands, and those in control were wary of scrutiny. After months of negotiation and the invocation of public interest, permission was granted for a limited inspection. The editor was accompanied by a small party that included a local official and a physician, the latter present to assess any materials that might be encountered. The visit was not announced widely, and it unfolded under an atmosphere of restrained tension, shaped by the understanding that whatever was found would be subject to competing interpretations. The main residence yielded the most immediate revelations. Behind doors long kept locked were rooms that did not align with conventional domestic use. Concealed basement spaces, accessible only through narrow passages, contained medical instruments consistent with mid-19th century practice. Some were familiar to the accompanying physician, tools associated with restraint, examination, and rudimentary treatment. Others were less easily classified, either because they were specialized or because their context rendered their purpose ambiguous. Alongside these instruments were journals written in a precise, methodical hand. The entries recorded observations, symptoms, and outcomes, though names were often abbreviated or omitted entirely. These journals became the most contested artifacts of the investigation. To some contemporaries, they represented evidence of systematic medical activity conducted in secrecy. To others, they were proof of an earnest, if misguided, attempt to apply medical knowledge in a private setting. The editor himself refrained from definitive judgment, noting only that the level of detail suggested sustained practice rather than occasional curiosity. The absence of clear patient identities, however, complicated any effort to connect the journals directly to specific individuals named in testimonies. Beyond the main house, attention turned to the landscape itself. Structures near the swamp, already noted for their isolation, showed signs of modification that exceeded normal housing requirements. Walls had been reinforced, windows altered or sealed, and interior layouts subdivided in ways that suggested confinement rather than habitation. The physician observed that some features mirrored those found in contemporary institutions for the mentally ill, though on a smaller and more improvised scale. Again, interpretation depended largely on perspective. Supporters of the plantation's former owner argued that such modifications were practical responses to environmental conditions or security concerns. Critics countered that their design implied deliberate separation and control. Perhaps the most emotionally charged aspect of the inspection involved areas of disturbed soil identified near these structures. The ground bore subtle irregularities, depressions and changes in vegetation that hinted at past digging. No formal excavation was conducted at the time, and no remains were uncovered during the visit. Still, the suggestion of unrecorded burials resonated powerfully with existing testimonies about disappearances. For some observers, these signs constituted circumstantial evidence of deaths concealed outside official records. For others, they were an invitation to speculation unsupported by proof, easily explained by erosion, animal activity, or abandoned construction. The editor's subsequent reporting reflected this tension. His articles laid out findings in careful language, distinguishing clearly between what had been observed and what had been inferred. He quoted witnesses alongside documents, presented photographs of rooms and structures, and acknowledged alternative explanations offered by critics. This approach drew both praise and condemnation. Abolitionist readers and reform-minded physicians saw the investigation as a long overdue exposure of abuse enabled by isolation and power. Defenders of the plantation's legacy accused the editor of sensationalism, arguing that he had assembled fragments into a narrative shaped more by moral outrage than by evidence. Public reaction was swift but divided. In urban centers where distance lent perspective and reformist sentiment was stronger, the reports fueled calls for greater oversight of private institutions and renewed scrutiny of slavery's hidden practices. In the region surrounding the plantation, responses were more guarded. Some locals dismissed the findings as an attack on established families and customs, while others acknowledged quietly that the estate had always been regarded as different, even unsettling. The absence of legal proceedings following the exposure underscored the limits of accountability. No charges were filed, and the matter receded from headlines as other events claimed public attention. For historians, the investigation occupies an ambiguous place. It produced tangible evidence that cannot be ignored, yet it stopped short of delivering definitive conclusions. The concealed rooms, instruments, and journals demonstrate that medical activity occurred beyond what had been publicly acknowledged. The modified structures and disturbed soil suggest practices that warrant suspicion but resist confirmation. The editor's work expanded the archive, transforming rumor into documented question, but it did not close the case. In retrospect, the significance of the investigation lies less in what it proved than in what it revealed about the mechanisms of silence. It showed how architecture, legal permission, and social deference could combine to shield activity from scrutiny. It also illustrated the difficulty of reconstructing truth in a landscape shaped by unequal power, where the voices most affected were the least recorded. The editor's insistence on presenting evidence alongside uncertainty stands as an early example of responsible inquiry, acknowledging both the necessity and the limits of exposure. The plantation, after the inspection, did not suddenly surrender its secrets. Many questions remained unanswered, and some will likely never be resolved. What did occur was a shift in how the estate was remembered. It was no longer simply a productive rice plantation with eccentric management, but a place associated with contested practices and unresolved harm. The findings, interpreted differently by contemporaries, ensured that the story could not return to obscurity unchanged. In this sense, the investigation marked a turning point not only for public awareness, but for the historical record itself. It introduced material evidence into a narrative long sustained by testimony and implication, complicating both. The coexistence of journals and silences, of instruments and unnamed individuals, underscores the challenge of historical judgment. What remains is a layered account, one in which exposure did not bring closure, but instead fixed uncertainty more firmly in place, demanding that later generations confront it with care rather than certainty. The response that followed public exposure unfolded within boundaries set long before any investigation began. The legal system of the time offered limited avenues for redress, particularly when the alleged victims were enslaved people, and the accused a property holder of standing. Plantation owners possessed broad authority over those they enslaved, authority reinforced by statutes that defined people as property and granted owners discretion over labor, discipline, and confinement. Within this framework, actions that might otherwise have prompted scrutiny were often rendered legally ambiguous or explicitly permitted. Court permissions previously granted to the owner further narrowed the grounds for prosecution. The approval to operate a private facility for the treatment of mental ailments, however loosely defined, created a protective barrier around activities conducted under its banner. Even if practices appeared harsh or misguided, they could be framed as medical judgment rather than criminal conduct. To challenge them required proof not only of harm, but of intent that exceeded the already expansive latitude allowed by law. Such proof was difficult to assemble in the absence of named victims, clear records, or surviving witnesses willing and able to testify under oath. As discussion intensified, momentum toward formal legal action faltered. Before proceedings could be initiated in any sustained way, the owner relocated, leaving the region quietly and without public explanation. Whether this move was prompted by fear of prosecution, by declining health, or by unrelated personal reasons remains uncertain. What is clear is that his departure effectively stalled any attempt to bring the matter before a court. Jurisdictional complications arose, and interest among officials waned as the practical challenges of pursuit increased. Without the accused present, and with evidence already contested, the prospect of a trial receded. Those associated with the plantation experienced consequences of a different kind. Former employees and professional collaborators faced criticism within their respective circles, particularly among physicians and administrators concerned with ethical standards. Questions were raised about complicity and oversight, about the willingness to accept unusual arrangements without inquiry. In some cases, reputations suffered and opportunities narrowed, yet these repercussions remained largely social and professional. Criminal accountability did not follow, in part because association alone was insufficient to establish wrongdoing, and in part because institutions were reluctant to extend scrutiny beyond the central figure who had already removed himself from reach. The broader public reaction reflected deep divisions already present in society. Abolitionist groups seized upon the reports as further evidence of slavery's capacity to conceal abuse behind legality and custom. Pamphlets and speeches referenced the plantation as an example of what could occur when absolute power met isolation and dehumanization. The language used was often careful, acknowledging disputed claims while emphasizing the moral implications of uncertainty itself. If such practices could not be definitively disproven, abolitionists argued, that uncertainty was itself an indictment of the system that allowed them to remain hidden. In contrast, local institutions responded with restraint bordering on silence. Churches, courts, and civic bodies in the region expressed concern about maintaining order and protecting established families from what they characterized as unproven accusations. Public statements, where they existed, emphasized the absence of formal charges and the danger of allowing journalism to substitute for legal process. Some officials privately acknowledged discomfort with the findings, but insisted that without clear statutory violations, intervention was neither appropriate nor possible. This reluctance was shaped not only by loyalty or fear, but by a legal culture that normalized wide-ranging authority over enslaved people. Newspapers outside the region continued to debate the case, often using it as a lens through which to examine broader questions of private power and institutional oversight. Editorials asked whether court permissions should be subject to review, and whether private facilities operating beyond public scrutiny posed inherent risks. Yet these discussions rarely translated into immediate reform. The plantation remained an example cited rather than a catalyst acted upon. Its story folded into a growing archive of moral argument rather than legislative change. For those who had testified, the aftermath was marked by ambiguity rather than resolution. Formerly enslaved individuals who had shared their experiences saw no formal acknowledgement of harm, no restitution, and no public vindication beyond the fact of having been heard. Their accounts circulated, read, and debated, but remained contested. Some expressed frustration that exposure did not lead to accountability, Others took quieter satisfaction in knowing that silence had been broken, even if consequences were limited. The act of testimony itself became a form of resistance, asserting memory against erasure. The plantation itself entered a period of decline. Without its former owner, and under the weight of scrutiny, its operations diminished. New managers avoided drawing attention, focusing on routine production and minimizing any association with past irregularities. Buildings fell into disuse, and the isolated structures near the swamp were gradually abandoned. Over time, physical decay did what legal action had not, erasing many traces of contested activity. Yet absence did not equate to forgetting. The site acquired a reputation that lingered in local memory, spoken of obliquely or not at all. In assessing the legal and social response, it becomes clear that the outcome was shaped less by the strength of evidence than by the limits of the system asked to judge it. Law, as it existed, was not designed to protect enslaved people from harm inflicted under the guise of ownership or sanctioned care. Social institutions invested in stability and hierarchy lacked both the incentive and the mechanisms to pursue accountability beyond symbolic disapproval. Journalism could illuminate, but it could not compel action where law and custom aligned against it. This disjunction between exposure and consequence highlights a central tension of the period. Knowledge alone was insufficient to produce justice when the structures governing society were built to absorb and neutralize discomfort. The plantation story did not end with trials or verdicts, but with dispersal of people, of responsibility, and of memory. The owner's relocation closed one chapter, while leaving the underlying questions unresolved. For later generations, the muted response became part of the narrative. It illustrated how systems of power respond when confronted with their own excesses, not through denial alone, but through procedural inertia and selective attention. The reluctance to pursue accountability was not simply a failure of courage, but a reflection of deeply embedded assumptions about who could be harmed, who could speak, and whose suffering warranted redress. In the wider abolitionist movement, the case contributed to a cumulative moral reckoning. It was cited not because it offered clear proof of atrocity, but because it demonstrated how easily atrocity could be obscured. The inability or unwillingness of local institutions to act reinforced arguments that reform from within was unlikely, that a system capable of accommodating such uncertainty was fundamentally flawed. In this way, the plantation's unresolved legacy fed into debates that extended far beyond its boundaries. The legal and social response, constrained and fragmented, left behind a record defined by gaps as much as by actions. What was permitted, what was ignored, and what was quietly allowed to fade all shaped the outcome. The absence of prosecution did not signify innocence, nor did public outrage produce justice. Instead, the episode settled into history as an example of how power, once exposed, can still evade consequence when protected by law, distance, and time. In the end, the plantation story did not conclude with resolution, but with dispersal into memory and argument. Its legacy lived on in editorials, testimonies, and cautious scholarship, a reminder that exposure does not guarantee accountability, and that the limits of the legal system can be as revealing as its actions. The silence that followed was not empty, but crowded with what could not be addressed, leaving future readers to confront a past where the question was not only what happened, but why so little was done when it came to light. In the years that followed the plantation's decline and the dispersal of its inhabitants, the individuals most closely connected to its contested history gradually receded from view. Survivors and witnesses who had once provided testimony appeared less and less frequently in public records, their lives unfolding beyond the reach of formal documentation. For many formerly enslaved people, this disappearance reflected not secrecy, but circumstance. Mobility, poverty, and the indifference of record-keeping institutions combined to erase traces that might otherwise have endured. Census returns list names that may or may not correspond to those earlier voices, offering possibilities rather than confirmation. Occasional unverified reports surfaced in later decades, suggesting that some individuals connected to the plantation resettled in northern states or crossed into Canada. These accounts appear in abolitionist correspondence and local histories, often as brief notes rather than sustained narratives. They speak of people who sought distance from the places that had defined their captivity, rebuilding lives in communities where anonymity offered safety. Yet such reports remain fragmentary, Without corroborating evidence, they hover at the edge of history, gestures towards survival rather than fully recoverable stories. Other figures left more visible traces, though not necessarily clearer ones. Associates of the former owner continued professional careers marked by quiet reputational damage but little lasting consequence. Their later writings and activities avoided reference to the plantation, as if omission itself might serve as erasure. The owner's own final years are poorly documented. He appears briefly in property records and correspondence from distant locales, then vanishes from the archive. Whether this absence reflects deliberate withdrawal or the ordinary fading of a private life remains unknown. As memories scattered, so too did material evidence. In the aftermath of public exposure, portions of the documents gathered by the investigating editor were preserved by medical and historical societies. Journals, excerpts from ledgers, and selected testimonies were archived as examples of contested practice and ethical concern. These materials were handled cautiously, often framed as illustrative rather than definitive. They were consulted intermittently by scholars interested in the history of medicine or slavery, their significance recognized but their implications debated. Not all evidence survived intact. Subsequent wars and periods of rapid urban development took a heavy toll on archival holdings. Fires, relocations, and institutional neglect resulted in losses that can now only be inferred from references in secondary sources. Physical findings from the plantation fared no better. Buildings deteriorated or were dismantled, landscapes reshaped by new ownership and new uses. What had once been identified as disturbed soil was leveled or built over, removing any possibility of later investigation. Each alteration narrowed the evidentiary horizon, replacing tangible questions with irretrievable absence. By the time modern scholarship turned sustained attention to the case, it did so in a context shaped by broader reassessment. Historians no longer approached the plantation as an isolated curiosity, but as part of a larger pattern in which slavery intersected with emerging medical practice. Studies of 19th century medicine increasingly acknowledged the extent to which experimentation, observation, and treatment were conducted on bodies denied consent and credibility. Within this framework, the plantation story assumed a different resonance. It was no longer merely anomalous, but illustrative of structural conditions that made abuse possible and, in some cases, routine. Scholars examining the surviving materials emphasized caution. They noted the unevenness of the archive, the reliance on testimony shaped by trauma, and the absence of definitive proof for some of the most serious allegations. At the same time, they resisted the temptation to let uncertainty function as dismissal. The convergence of documented medical interest, legal permission, architectural adaptation, and repeated testimony suggested more than coincidence. While acknowledging that the plantation was not unique, researchers treated it as a particularly well-documented example of how authority could operate without meaningful oversight. Within studies of medical ethics, the case has been cited as evidence of the discipline's entanglement with systems of domination. It illustrates how the language of care and improvement could coexist with practices that inflicted harm, especially when subjects were enslaved people whose suffering carried little legal or moral weight. The absence of consent, the use of isolation and restraint, and the lack of accountability align with patterns identified in other settings, from hospitals to laboratories. In this sense, the plantation becomes part of a continuum rather than an exception. The reassessment has also reshaped understanding of survivor testimony. Where earlier commentators questioned credibility on the basis of inconsistency or emotional tone, later scholars have emphasized the coherence of themes across accounts separated by time and circumstance. Rather than seeking exact corroboration, they attend to patterns of experience, secrecy, fear, disappearance, and enforced silence. These recurring elements, they argue, offer insight into lived realities that administrative records were never designed to capture. Importantly, modern scholarship situates the case within the moral economy of slavery itself. The plantation did not require extraordinary cruelty to enable harm. It relied on ordinary legal structures that defined people as property and granted owners extraordinary discretion. The medical activities, whether well-intentioned or exploitative, unfolded within this framework. To isolate them from slavery's broader violence would be to misunderstand their foundation. The case thus serves as a reminder that systemic abuse does not always announce itself through spectacle, but often through routine exercised without scrutiny. public memory of the plantation has followed a similar trajectory. Once spoken of in whispers or avoided altogether, it has gradually entered historical discourse as an example of unresolved injustice. Museums, academic conferences, and educational materials reference it cautiously, emphasizing contested evidence and the importance of ethical reflection. The goal is not to sensationalize, but to acknowledge complexity without obscuring harm. In doing so, these presentations challenge earlier tendencies to prioritize institutional reputation over human experience. At the same time, the limits of what can be known remain central to any reassessment. Scholars openly acknowledge that key questions will never be answered. Who exactly was subjected to treatment, what outcomes followed, and how many lives were altered or ended cannot be established with certainty. This incompleteness is not treated as a failure of inquiry, but as a feature of histories shaped by power imbalance. The absence of answers becomes part of the lesson, illustrating how systems can produce silence as effectively as they produce records. The plantation story, reframed through modern lenses, thus occupies a careful position. It is neither reduced to myth nor elevated to singular horror. Instead, it stands as one among many sites where slavery and medicine intersected, distinguished by the unusual survival of evidence and testimony. Its value lies not in confirming every allegation, but in revealing the conditions that made such allegations plausible and resistant to resolution. For descendants of enslaved people and for communities shaped by this past, the reassessment offers limited solace. Recognition does not restore lost lives or erase names, yet it does affirm that suffering once doubted is now taken seriously, that silence imposed by law and custom is no longer accepted as neutrality. The preservation of fragments, however incomplete, allows memory to persist where official acknowledgement once failed. In the end, the later developments surrounding the plantation underscore a broader truth about historical reckoning. Evidence survives unevenly, shaped by chance and power, while interpretation evolves as values change. What was once dismissed as rumor can later be understood as testimony constrained by circumstance. The plantation's legacy, refracted through loss and reassessment, reveals not only what happened there, but how societies choose to remember or forget. Its place in modern scholarship rests on this dual recognition. It is an example, not the only one, of systemic abuse enabled by slavery and shielded by legality and isolation. And it is a reminder that ethical progress depends not solely on new laws or discoveries, but on the willingness to confront uncertainty without retreating into denial. The plantation's history remains unsettled, but its relevance endures, challenging each generation to consider how power operates when left unchecked, and how many stories remain incomplete because the structures that produced them were designed to ensure they would be. When viewed as a whole, the history of the plantation resolves less into a sequence of events than into a set of enduring themes that speak to the nature of power and its ethical limits. At its center lies a convergence of scientific ambition and social domination, a pairing that was neither accidental nor rare in the 19th century. The pursuit of knowledge, particularly in fields as poorly understood as mental illness, carried with it an aura of progress and authority. When joined to a system that denied humanity to those under study, that authority became effectively absolute. The plantation demonstrates how easily the language of improvement could be mobilized within structures of oppression, transforming people into instruments of inquiry without their consent or protection. What makes this case especially revealing is not the extremity of any single alleged act, but the conditions that allowed uncertainty itself to persist. Legal sanction, architectural isolation, and administrative compartmentalization combined to create a space where intention and outcome were shielded from scrutiny. Scientific curiosity did not need to be overtly malicious to cause harm. It needed only to operate without restraint, accountability, or regard for the autonomy of those subjected to it. In such an environment, ethical boundaries were not crossed so much as rendered irrelevant, dissolved by a hierarchy that defined some lives as inherently available for use. Within this context, testimony assumed a significance that far exceeded its formal standing. Survivor accounts, dismissed or contested in their own time, proved essential in challenging secrecy and denial. They provided the connective tissue between disparate fragments of evidence, linking architectural anomalies to administrative gaps and personal suffering to institutional practice. Even where details could not be verified, The recurrence of certain themes across independent voices lent them weight. Silence, isolation, disappearance, and fear appeared again and again, not as isolated impressions but as shared experience. The importance of these testimonies lies not only in what they revealed, but in the fact that they existed at all. To speak after escape or dismissal was to assert a claim to truth in a society structured to deny it. These accounts disrupted the presumption that legality equated to legitimacy, insisting instead that lived experience mattered even when it could not be fully documented. In doing so, they exposed the fragility of systems that depended on the absence of witness. Once spoken, such experiences could be questioned, but they could not be entirely erased. At the same time, the plantation's history illustrates the limits of accountability in a legal order designed to protect property rather than people. 19th century institutions were ill-equipped and often unwilling to defend enslaved individuals from harm inflicted under the guise of ownership or sanctioned care. Courts required standards of proof that excluded those most affected, while permissions granted in advance insulated actors from later challenge. Journalism could illuminate and provoke, but without supportive legal mechanisms, exposure rarely translated into justice. This failure was not merely procedural, it was structural. The inability to prosecute or even formally investigate allegations stemmed from assumptions embedded in law and custom about who counted as a rights-bearing subject. Enslaved people existed within the legal imagination as objects of management, not as individuals entitled to bodily integrity or informed consent. In such a framework, abuse did not need to be concealed entirely, it needed only to be framed as permissible. The plantation's unresolved case thus reflects not an anomaly of enforcement, but the ordinary operation of a system aligned against accountability. The aftermath further underscores this point. Relocation replaced trial, professional criticism substituted for criminal consequence, and public debate dissipated without institutional reform. Responsibility dispersed rather than concentrated, leaving no single moment of reckoning. What remained was a residue of doubt and discomfort, sufficient to trouble reputations and memories, but insufficient to compel redress. This pattern would repeat itself in other contexts, reinforcing the lesson that systems built on inequality tend to absorb challenges without fundamentally changing. Yet the story does not end in failure alone. Its legacy lies in how it has been taken up by later generations, particularly within discussions of medical ethics and human rights. As modern scholarship revisited the plantation, it did so with conceptual tools unavailable to contemporaries, ideas of informed consent, bodily autonomy, and structural violence. Within these frameworks, practices once defended as benevolent or neutral could be re-examined as ethically compromised, regardless of intent. The focus shifted from individual culpability to systemic conditions, from isolated acts to enabling environments. In this reassessment, the plantation contributes to a broader understanding of how medical knowledge has been produced historically. It stands as one example among many where marginalized bodies became sites of experimentation precisely because their suffering carried little consequence. By situating the case alongside others, scholars have resisted both sensationalism and minimization. The plantation is neither uniquely monstrous nor morally neutral. It is instructive because it reveals how ordinary ambitions, when paired with extraordinary power, can produce lasting harm. The role of historical memory is central to this legacy. For much of its existence, the plantation story survived in fragments, spoken cautiously or not at all. Its gradual incorporation into public discourse reflects changing values as much as new evidence. What was once dismissed as rumor is now approached as testimony constrained by circumstance. This shift does not resolve uncertainty, but it alters how uncertainty is understood. Absence of proof is no longer treated as proof of absence, particularly where the archive itself was shaped by domination. In educational and commemorative contexts, the case now serves as a prompt rather than a conclusion. It invites reflection on how societies decide which lives merit protection, which voices merit belief, and which practices merit scrutiny. It challenges narratives of scientific progress divorced from ethical responsibility, reminding audiences that knowledge acquired through coercion carries its own moral burden. In doing so, it connects the past to ongoing debates about research ethics, consent, and the legacy of exploitation. For descendants and communities affected by slavery, This recognition carries complex meaning. Acknowledgement does not repair loss, but it affirms that suffering once denied is now part of the historical record. The willingness to name uncertainty rather than smooth it over represents a form of respect for experiences that cannot be fully recovered. Memory, in this sense, becomes an ethical practice, one that resists the closure offered by silence. The plantation's historical significance thus lies in its capacity to illuminate patterns rather than provide answers. It shows how power operates most effectively when it appears ordinary, sanctioned, and private. It demonstrates the fragility of ethical claims made without accountability and the necessity of testimony in challenging systems designed to suppress it. It reveals the limits of law when law is aligned with oppression and the slow, uneven process by which societies come to recognize that alignment. Ultimately, the themes that emerge from this history remain unsettled because they are ongoing. Scientific ambition continues to raise questions about consent and vulnerability. Institutions still struggle to hold power to account, particularly when harm occurs out of public view. Testimony remains essential, yet contested, especially when it emerges from those historically denied authority. The plantation story endures not because it is complete, but because it mirrors these enduring tensions. In remembering it, historians and readers alike are asked to sit with ambiguity rather than resolve it too quickly. The lack of definitive answers is not a failure of inquiry, but a reminder of how thoroughly inequality can shape what is known. What the plantation offers, above all, is a cautionary lesson: that progress pursued without ethical restraint can entrench injustice, and that systems capable of silencing voices once will do so again unless actively challenged. Its legacy contributes to ongoing discussions not as a closed case, but as a reference point. It stands as evidence that human rights and medical consent are not abstract principles, but hard-won responses to histories of misuse. By tracing how harm was enabled, obscured, and later reassessed, the plantation's history underscores the responsibility of the present to learn from the past without simplifying it. In this way, its significance lies not only in what happened, but in how its story continues to shape conversations about power, ethics, and memory long after the fields fell silent. In drawing these threads together, Greystone Manor emerges not as an isolated curiosity, but as a case study situated at the intersection of slavery, medicine, and authority. Its significance lies in how ordinary structures of power enabled extraordinary vulnerability. The plantation functioned within legal and social norms of its time, yet those norms permitted practices that blurred the boundary between care and coercion, inquiry and exploitation. Medicine, framed as improvement and management, found fertile ground in a system that denied consent and rendered suffering administratively invisible. Authority, reinforced by law and custom, operated most effectively where oversight was weakest and silence most complete. The episode underscores the necessity of critical examination when approaching historical sources shaped by inequality. Official records designed to account for property and productivity reveal little of interior lives or unrecorded harm. They offer precision without perspective, numbers without names. Testimony, by contrast, carries memory and emotion, but is often fragmented, contested, and shaped by trauma. Neither form of evidence is sufficient on its own. Only by placing them in dialogue can historians begin to approach a fuller understanding, one that neither dismisses uncertainty nor mistakes documentation for truth. Greystone Manor also illustrates how historical inquiry itself evolves. What earlier generations ignored or minimized, later scholars reconsidered, not because new evidence resolved every question, but because ethical frameworks changed. Concepts such as consent, human rights, and structural violence reshaped how the past could be read. In this light, the plantation's unresolved aspects are not failures of scholarship, but indicators of how power once constrained what could be known. Absence becomes meaningful, silence a subject of analysis rather than an endpoint. Most importantly, the case remains a reminder that historical inquiry can restore partial voice to those marginalized by past systems. While it cannot recover every name or confirm every account, it can resist erasure by taking testimony seriously and acknowledging harm even where proof is incomplete. In doing so, it challenges narratives that equate legality with morality or progress with benevolence. Greystone Manor stands as a reminder that the past continues to speak, not always clearly but insistently, and that listening carefully is itself an ethical act. Greystone Manor stands as a reminder that the past continues to speak, not always clearly but insistently, and that listening carefully is itself an ethical act.